All right, hello everybody. This is GM Kraai, and we're gonna come back to this road to 2500. Every week I come here and try to update my own chess progress, what I'm trying to do with it. And today I was actually late for my own show because I was studying this game just so intently that I lost complete track of time. And so it's been a very interesting experience. And the first thing that I want to say about it is that, when you read the old time Russian books, they're always talking about adjournment analysis as the way to get good at analyzing, and in particular, endgames. And I am old enough to have had adjournments, but of course, it was something that kind of ended by 1990. I guess it was kind of over as a thing, both because not just because of computers, but also because people didn't like it anymore, and the time controls were getting faster anyway. One interesting thing is a game I remember being adjourned was I had a game in the U.S. Open, like 1989, I think, against Stuart Rachels, who then won the U.S. championship like a year later. And Sam Hamilton, who I've reconnected with, he helped me do my adjournment back then, and I was playing the Denker at the same time. So that's my one memory. Is kind of funny because, and I thought of it because Stuart Rachels just came out with a book. He hasn't played forever, but he came out with a book just now about playing chess. So, with that said, what I'm trying to say is this is the longest analysis of a game I've ever done, and this ending I've spent a fair amount of time on, a lot of time on. I have over 30 pages of handwritten notes here. So, Josh Friedel might join me in a little bit to give me some advice about what I was doing. And the other check on my analysis, it would be interesting just to see if he thinks, I'm doing some kind of systematic mistake. And what I mean by that is like, when you go really deep into some position, you might just be missing something completely obvious. And so, in that vein, next week, what I'm going to do, I know I'm beating this game to death, but next week I am going to turn on the computer in a couple positions to see what the computer thinks of a couple key positions, and I have them kind of mapped out in my mind. And I am using this show because maybe I mean that in a slightly negative way, because I have a hard time myself often listening to the computer after I've done all my analysis. So putting that on the show will be, a helpful thing to force me to look at what the computer says. Boris, thank you so much. So let me just say that this position arises from the decision I made back here playing knight b6, and I guess I saw this coming. And the only thing I have to say for myself is I was pretty certain I had compensation. Did I have enough? I don't know. I definitely was feeling frisky. That is, I wanted to win. Both because I enjoy playing, and it was like, I think if I didn't win this game, the tournament was kind of over for me anyway. I was not having the greatest event. So we're going to get into this position, and my opponent played King G2 and has a very concrete plan that we looked at the beginnings of last week. But to my mind, I want to say that intuitively anyway, the strongest attempt for white would have been rook a8, king g7, rook b8, bishop c5. And here I spent mountains of time trying to figure out if white could pull off some kind of advantage here. So the first question is, well, how about rook b7, just to stop black in his tracks? And the nice variation I found for black here was g5, and the intention is king g2 is pretty necessary, and then black plays rook c3. And the point of this is that all of the f4s aren't great because I'll take and then I'm threatening f3. And another great feature of this is I'm ready to play rook a3 if I need to block off all of the entrances to the black position. And white could think about rook a2, but it's going to be really hard to prevent counterplay, and especially because this isn't a threat yet. So I think even rook c4, let's say king f3, h5, and I feel like black has pretty good play, but this is still a real fighting attempt for white. We'll see, though, that white has some of his own ideas that aren't ridiculous. So king g2. Now here, I want to add one more thing about that variation, and that is, so I said to myself, well, maybe because g5 and rook c3 is such a big thing, maybe he should just play king g2 now. And the interesting thing here for me is that f5 seems to be good counterplay, i.e. rook b7 was necessary. And the point is, like, let's say you check, I'm just going to come up, and if let's say ef, now black will win the d5 pawn, and he is getting some play. And of course, the b pawn is going to be a runner at some point as well. And in addition to this, e4 is also kind of interesting to activate the king, but I like rook d4 best. And I analyzed that for a long time and felt that it was dynamically kind of interesting but holdable for black. And one thing about this position in particular, and there will be several like it, is just an obvious thing that every GM will tell you, is that in the endgame, if you got a rook and a bishop or a rook and a knight against two rooks, you really do not want to trade a rook because the white rooks are doing a lot of the same tasks, whereas the bishop really, and we'll see especially when the board opens up, will control about as many squares as the rook, and the only deficit is that it can't go to the white squares, right? So that's a key thing to bear in mind in understanding this endgame, that the rook and the bishop can work really well together because the rook can compensate the loss of the light squares. And that's the key also to understanding what we call the Fisher ending, right? The rook and bishop versus rook and knight. Okay. Paul in New Jersey, glad you listened to the interview. Yeah, I did an interview on Ben Johnson's Perpetual Chess podcast recently, and you guys can check that out if you like. So I then made a frisky move here, and this is indicative of a lot of what's going to get me in trouble. What should I play? I should play king g7 for sure. And I played this frisky move, bishop d4. So this, I couldn't find a win for white. I just found a way for it to make my life difficult after bishop d4. But let's just talk about the friskiness for a second. With bishop d4, I'm trying to make b3 happen at some point. I'm trying to punish white a little bit for not playing rook a8, b8. So now, of course, we're saying if he plays the rook, I'm going to get b3 in. And the problem with the friskiness is really that I shouldn't be trying to win in this position, even though I want to so much. In fact, there will be better chances for me to win if I just sit, because then white will come at me and then I might have actual chances. And that's a key thing that Magnus Carlsen said. I mentioned, I think, on the last show, of the difference between him and his fellow GMs, that he knows when to go all in and when to pull it back. And especially, I think, being an American playing in opens, you're kind of encouraged to be frisky. And so here I'm being a little too frisky. Okay, f4. Let's look at what he. Oh, so where is it difficult? If the guy plays rook a8, that's when it can become a little difficult for me with something like this. And now I need to react very quickly because f4 for white is coming. And so I looked forever at this position. And yeah, it's remarkably close here. So f4, fe, and somehow I'm kind of sort of maybe surviving this thing with, I believe, in this position. Actually, this was a great analysis position. At first I was like, oh, it really is all over for black, because imagine rook c2, king h3. And I think originally when I first looked at this position, I said to myself, well, bishop g1, I'm going to have some kind of compensation. But the bummer is, like, bishop g1, fe, I really don't have anything. And the hilarious thing is on h5, it looks really powerful, but the dude's just going to come up. And what's funny is we're going to see a mirror image of this kind of tactic a little later on in the position. So that didn't work for me. However, instead of rook c2, if I play just king f6, it seems I couldn't find anything clear for white. And the point is really that when he takes, I'm going to take back this way, and the king is dreaming of getting close to this pawn. And the biggest thing I got to do right away is just stop that advance. So here too, I couldn't find really a clear path for white, but this is getting really dangerous, very dangerous for me. So that's why I felt with bishop d4, I was giving a chance that I didn't need to give, that I could have just played king g7. And we end up transposing to that in the game. Okay, fe, bishop e5, rook a7, b3, rook f2, bishop f6, rook b7. Okay, so it was clearly the intention of my opponent to get this position, to activate the rooks. And it's not totally ridiculous. And kind of at the end of last show, left it here with a question of, well, what should I do? Should I play b2 or rook takes e4? And during the broadcast, I had kind of, last week's broadcast, I'd kind of even forgotten what was my fear on b2. And it turns out I think both are probably drawing, but I came to the conclusion that b2 was more accurate. But in order to understand, in order to get to play b2, you have to kind of go down a dark road that most people wouldn't want to go down. Okay. b2. The move to fear, though, is e5. All right, so first things first. If we take with the pawn, rook takes. And the bummer is that the reason we take back with the b rook is that now the rooks are going to be coordinated and able to push the pawn. So for example, e4, rook c2. Let me just show rook d4 as an example, even though it's the wrong move. Rook fd2, and you cannot trade rooks. And so I am not completely convinced that I'm absolutely lost here, but I do know that it is very bad news. My intuition is that it's lost because the e4 pawn is going to be weak, and obviously the d pawn's rolling. And even if you don't push the pawn, right, the king is going to try to be active after black is pushed onto passive defense. So that's the problem with b2, or at least the fear. You have to address e5. So one of the great things about this analysis was I was able to consider moves that in my rational mind I wouldn't necessarily consider. And so I considered bishop e5. well, okay. I have a feeling if Josh is going to come on at some point, he's going to be like, dude, you can't play chess this way, right? So we got snip. Looks absolutely abysmal. King h6. Okay. So let's just talk basics. Obviously, I'm afraid of getting mated, but the drama for white is that I've got counterplay plus rook c1 coming. That's going to be a problem. So first, let's look at rook h7, just so you can get a feel for the position. There's no mate, and my king is actually pretty active. And I didn't see anything here because rook c1 is coming, and then your rook is like, well, what are you gonna do? You're gonna go all the way back or something? I don't know what you're gonna do. So yeah, for example, I think there was a nice variation here. Here check. Actually, I might as well go to c1 first. I think it'll be similar. Rook c1, rook here, check. And there's no way to keep in contact with this rook. So you're going to have to play like bishop d4. So for example, king h3, rook c1. And anytime you go to g1, I'm checking. So rook f2 here. And you can take, but I assumed that this was not going to be enough. In particular, I go and harass the pawn. Okay. But that wasn't the most scary thing for white. Bishop e5, snip, king h6, h4. It looks absolutely ridiculous. Well, king h5, and all of a sudden it's a little party here because king g4 is a threat. So like takes, it's not clear. Maybe black's going to win now. So there's an obvious question. What about king h3? And then you say h6, and it's kind of miraculous, really. Yeah, it is miraculous. Yeah, it's like, what? How did this happen? So I couldn't find anything for white in this position. Okay. So, is rook e4 better than b2? On a practical level, probably, but we still, on a theoretical or analysis level, it's still a kind of interesting question of rook e4, rook b3. And now here's my blunder. I blundered in this position. But the question is, after rook e7, does white have any chance to win this thing? And let's say on an intuitive level, both Josh Friedel and I believed that this was entirely drawn for black, or holdable, whatever you want to call it. And I think it is. But I spent loads of time here, and I at least made it be a little bit difficult. And one of the things that's, barely holding on for black that's really important is that I can't immediately play rook b6 because of bishop d4. If I could play rook b6, the whole situation would be a lot closer. And also on a first level, it might seem like, oh, black's not doing anything, but let me give you my variation here that I thought was interesting. By the way, let me just say there's two, well, let's call it three ideas for white. Obviously, you want to win the d6 pawn. You want to trade a rook. And the darker thing about this, and we're going to see this in several variations, is we want to get the king over here to c6. And with the two rooks on, it's very difficult to achieve. But there's some variations where it happens. But it's very difficult to achieve because the king gets knocked around so much. With obviously the rooks off, it'll be much easier. And let's just say the thing that white should be imagining already is some kind of ending where we sack the exchange on d6, but are still winning because this pawn is so close and because the king somehow gets in the vicinity and is allowed to shepherd the pawn down. Okay, so the variation, the best I could do for white was rook d2, and this is not only to protect the pawn, but to keep the nasty bishop out of d4. Now, a good move for black is h5. We want to put the pawns on light squares so that they complement the bishop on dark squares, and we want to both generate a little fuss on the king side so that if the white king does roll away, there might be some drama, and also the king might have some drama too if we get the pawns on, let's say, g4. It's one of the reasons why king f3, which is the move I want to make, is really not the best, because he ends up getting popped with a tempo with g5, g4. So anyways, here was the best I could do for white. Rook b6, bishop e5, rook c6. Okay, so the idea is to play here and here. g5, rook c2. Okay, so the first instinct was that if he got to c7, that I would be toast. And so just to show you, if king g6, rook c7 does force the trade of rooks. Besides king g6, g4, the same thing. White gets the exchange of rooks. And there it looks very bad, though I did analyze it forever, and it's still a little bit complicated. But let's say the move that black should be thinking of anyway is not trading the rooks. And so we get a variation like this. Rook a7, rook c7, rook a5. And the terrible thing for white is he just doesn't have much going on. For example, rook f2, bishop f6, right? And there's no easy answers about, defending this pawn and or creating drama against the bishop, or the pawn on f7, for example, here and here. And we're doing fine. So, rook e7, as suspected, should be drawing for black. And probably from a human standpoint, rook e4 is better than b2, because e5 really is some high drama if we allow that. Okay. So, all right, my blunder here. Now, this is a weird blunder to address, to think about, because first of all, there's two moves that I think refute this. And, I'm getting, part of it is, though, beyond just having, I guess, what is a senior moment here, it's also that I'm just being a little frisky here. Both bishop d4 moves in this game were frisky moves. And I don't really have the right to be frisky here. So it's really kind of weird that I missed, because there's two moves here that I think win for white, and it's really hard for me to imagine. I think, okay, let's go through them. There's rook f4, and there's rook b4. I think rook b4 is actually stronger. Rook f4 is what happened in the game. And, did I see this? If I did, shame on me. f5, for example, and rook d2 looks strong, but even rook d2 and then rook b7, it just seems really hard to deal with, because now, this is an important feature of the game in general too, when I move that f-pawn, I increase the scope of the rook on the 7th rank, and we're going to see that in the game too, and that's what Nimzovich calls the absolute 7th, when the rook gets to control all the squares. Okay, so very strange mistake, but here's the funny thing. Even though bishop d4 is by all means the biggest mistake in this game, both sides make a lot of mistakes, but it's the mistake which most dramatically changes the evaluation of the position, right? I went from something like holding but worse to lost in one move. And so you'd say to yourself, if you were thinking about it in terms of the engine, that that was the biggest mistake. But, you know, it's this weird thing. It's like senior moments are going to happen even to the young. And this one is so weird that I'm just saying I'm not beating myself up too much for it. In some level of my mind, I was seeing rook f4, rook e2, but the problem there is just king f1. And I guess I was seeing some other weird thing with rook b4, f5, which is just ridiculous. Not only because of rook b7, but after rook d2, you are still allowing the trade of rooks, and you don't want that position. Right. So, very bizarre failure, but I'm not sure. I'm mad. Let me just put it this way. I think it's important when you analyze your games, I'll speak for myself, when I analyze my games, to whip yourself for the right, on the right occasions. And this one is just, like, I don't know. I obviously can't do it, but the blunders, they're kind of hard to completely eradicate anyway, whereas the positional mistakes, those are the ones I get a little bit more mad at myself. All right, let me show you what happened. I thought rook b4 is technically stronger, but it's quite possible that rook f4 is winning as well. So rook f4, I got it. Unfortunately, rook e2, it's not going to work, right? Actually, Josh is noticing a very interesting point that I did study. So bishop d4, rook b4 takes, excuse me, let me do this right. I was looking at, there's more than one way to do this, right? Here, this one I came to the conclusion that maybe white could actually hold this thing. So there's that, and with this one, I felt this was obviously lost. And what we'll see in contrast to the game is here the white pawns are far more flexible, and yeah, I can't even do much here. Say after rook e7 and rook d7, there's not a lot of play. And the king, where's the king going to go? He's going to go to c6, and then I'm going to have a problem. So, right, and rook b4, f5, then there's this interesting thing where I believe it's like rook d2, bishop c5, let's say, rook b7, and I didn't understand how I was supposed to live through that one, right? It just seemed completely lost for me to give up the 7th like that. Yeah. We're going to see Josh. Josh is talking about a fortress, and that's clearly what Black's intention is. We're going to see it gets real close in a lot of variations, even this one with rook f4. And I'll say, just to be clear, I don't have a lot of time left, but I do get 30 seconds to move. And during the game, did I think I was lost here? Probably, but I did know that there was going to be some chances, and I felt actually the way it went that I was going to have reasonable chances. We'll see. It's pretty involved. So, king f6 is what I played. Rook b7, h6. Okay. I think this is a critical moment for white. What he does is arguably winning, but it's not immediately obvious that it's winning. And maybe Josh will disagree with, maybe he'll find something for the analysis that I give for white. But the move that seemed far more convincing to me here for white is just to play h4, and it's a very hard business for me here. I could also, I think, throw in rook d7 first and then play h4. Both are kind of similar. And right, I'm in a position where it's going to get hard to move. And let's go through. Let's just move around for a little while, right? Here, 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 and white's going to come over to talk to me. And I didn't have, yeah, I feel like if I lose the d6 pawn, that's Crispy's for me. And then one key thing is all of the pawn endgames. Let's say I give up all my pawns. If he just wins the pawn with rook takes d6, all of those are lost. So that was my sense here, that would have been the easier way for him to play here with h4. All right, so Josh is saying that if he can expand on the king side with the bishop e5, that looks drawn. Well, at least, whether it's true or not, that was also just during the game, that was my intuition. So king f3, and I thought it was a big deal that he allowed me g5. He then played h3, and I thought it was an achievement for me to get my bishop on e5, which I'm now going to get. So for example, if you wanted to play this way with just king f3 and just kind of kick it, then rook d7, bishop c5, king f3, g5 seems more convincing to me that this could be, an easier deal for him. But let's look what he did. Let's look at what he did. King f3, g5, h3, snip, snip, bishop e5, king e4, king g6, and let's put on this position on the board, rook e7. All right. So it's black to move, and the question is, A, what should I do, and what's the evaluation of the position? During the game, while you guys are thinking about it, I will say that I definitely felt I had made progress. And yeah, I definitely felt like white had given me things he shouldn't have. And somewhere around here, I did some bad chess culture, and I offered a draw. Now, it was terrible in hindsight, especially because I think this position's winning for white, for me to have done so. But at the time, I really did kind of think like, oh, this won't be that hard to hold. Okay. So, Josh is thinking he likes the pawn on f4. Well, okay. It did allow me to trade it off and to get this position. So I definitely think that I made a mistake here. And, well, it's going to go very quickly downhill for me. But I'll show you what I did. And, yeah, I played f5. And the intuition behind this terrible move. This, by the way, this is a funny thing when I think about what things I should be mad about with my own play. And this one, even though I think I'm lost either way, I'm mad at myself for this one because it seems really misguided. Let me just say first what the superficial reasoning is that I'm using the pawn to control a lot of squares. Right? I get all those squares now with the bishop. But the reason it just seems in hindsight so terrible is that I'm giving the white rook so much more scope. I'm giving him this, I'm giving him that, all of those squares. So my intuition after the game, where I'm beating myself up just thinking about it on my own, it's like, well, wait a second. I mean, don't I have something like a fortress here? And, right. This, first of all, definitely the better decision. It's very difficult for white to come at me. So let me just show you what I came up with here. So f5 looks good to Neil. Well, it looked good to me too. So we'll come back to f5, and I'll just show you how this kind of shakes out. So rook e8. Let me show you bishop h2. There's a couple different things I can do, but they honestly end up kind of at the same place. Rook g8. Let's say bishop e5, rook g2. And now we're having a problem where the black bishop is, you either have to let me have the f5 square or you have to move the bishop. Let's say we move the bishop. Right, and now check to the miserable king. Rook f5. And the intention for white is to play h4, h5. And the brutality of it is bishop e1 doesn't really stop anything because I still come over. And let's say king f4. h5 is just brutally met with rook g5, and you either win the pawn or let the king totally in. So let's just do a couple moves here. Bishop f2, bishop e1, h4. Let's move the bishop again somewhere. h5, king g7. And now my first instinct was, oh, well, if I get the king on f5, it's winning. But that actually, the king on f5 isn't that impressive. It's more like this. Here, let's say here. And black's not doing anything. I mean, white's not doing anything that special. Black's not doing anything that special, I mean. Now let's just start moving this guy around. Let's go here. Check, and now there's this position. With this position, by the way, I arrived at a variety of move orders because I tried it again and again, and the bishop, gets run out of squares. And king f6, which is the active-looking move, was losing pretty clearly to rook d7 because I'm going to take on d6 and it's game over. Nota bene here, king g5. Well, I can't, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, king g5 would be an attempt, and the bummer there is you're on the queening square, so here, c7, and close but no cigar, right, because of that. So you can see, black is actually in a lot of ways really close, and for a while I thought even I could be very clever and go king f8, rook d7, and now check this out, f5. And for a half a second here, it feels like maybe black's going to hold this thing. Well, I tried, Josh. Josh is asking about the king on f5. I couldn't find anything with the king on f5. I think this is, and so I came up with this, and this is, I think, a very instructive position. If rook let's just say, for example, you do the natural thing here. By the way, this is obviously black, white has achieved everything, but his king is obviously a little bit afield, as is his rook. Far afield, as they say. So f5, if you take now on d6, you're not going to win the race, right? I get to f1 in time. So the natural move is to say, okay, rook h7, f4 takes, let's say, king f7, and it's not so easy all of a sudden. The pawn will get to f3, or excuse me, f2, and I couldn't find, I still thought that was going to be winning. But I couldn't find a clear path to make that work. So the interesting move, the exclam, I thought, for white here was to go back now. Because what you've achieved is you've achieved the f-pawn giving the white rook all of that breathing room. So for example, now I'm just going to go ahead and push f2. There's no... I can make white play king d2, e1, whatever, to force me to play f2, but it's ultimately something that has to happen. So f2, king e2, just to show some variations here. King f1. Now, even this position, because the pawn on f2, maybe you say to yourself, well, maybe there's a chance. But the bummer is like, black gets run out of moves, like here again. And it's very hard to move the bishop. You can't move the bishop on c5. So then this happens to you. and you again can't really do much, and then this happens to you, and then, maybe something like this. And now I'm just going to walk the king all the way up. Game over. That was stunning to me. Right. So what are the amazing things about this kind of analysis? I'm doing this all by hand. It's like that was move 50 where the variation kind of splits, and now we're on move 83. And I haven't even got to king g6 yet. Yeah. So, man, what I'm trying to say is I couldn't find a draw here in this position for black where I don't, f5 was the move that I feel like loses. Well, in the game I didn't understand how terrible it was, obviously. It was just a little bit later I was like, oh no. Oh no, I've really blown this one. So, yeah, let me show you the terribleness of this game here. So I played f5, king f3, and the bummer that we're going to see is that my bishop is going to run out of squares in a variety of positions. And it's very typical of endgame studies, like rook and bishop endgame studies. But, one of the great things I took away from this analysis I did was, in a real game, let's call it that, you're going to get thousands of little studies, really, are all going to be involved here with white winning this game. So let me just show. Bishop h2, rook e6. And of course, because I was feeling frisky, or whatever you want to call it, I wanted to move my king up. Well, it's a big problem, unfortunately. Let's say king g5, h4. I can't take on h4 because of the stupid bishop on h2. And on king h5, I'm just getting totally zugzwanged with a move like this. And nota bene, I can't do this. Pawn's running. Life is over. So that was a major bummer. And if I go king h5, it doesn't make really much difference because dude just plays h4 still. And bishop e5, I'm not in the box. Bishops run out of squares. And of course, if I lose the d6 pawn, it's all over. So, just to be honest, it was only around here that I said to myself, oh no, things are looking really bad. I am not going to survive this thing. So, Josh says, if I wasn't stuck on the terrible h2 square, it would be nothing for what? Yeah. No, there's some interesting things where, like, intuitively, especially, let me just say this. One of the reasons that I felt like he had given me so much was the bishop on e5. It looks so amazing. And, especially actually with the two, I actually meant to say, let me go back a second. When the rook and the bishop are on the board, let me just do something dogmatic here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's pretty much what you're going to get out of a rook any day anyway. So I felt like, the bishop is amazing. And of course, it's only when the guy gets traded off that he's terrible. But even then, he let me on e5 in the endgame, right? Because I got on e5 once and then I got it on again. And I felt like, oh, I'm going to have some chances. All right, let me show how bad it went. King g7, h4. And now I have another terrible decision to make. I played h5, which I knew wasn't pleasant for the peasant. If bishop e5, the real bummer is after h5, I'm going to get run out of moves again, and the easiest way to see it is like bishop h2, rook g6, rook f6, and that's it. Notice, too, it's really nice is that these pawns fixing, using the light squares to fixate those pawns on black squares is great because it means that black will have no entrance for counterplay. I need to get to like g5 or e5 for counterplay, and here I'm just going to have nothing. So I played h5, rook e2, check to the miserable king, king h6, and here my opponent gave me another chance and then I'm really close to drawing again. The simple move, if I can call it that, would have been rook g8, because if say king or bishop f6 now, this is totally toast, totally toast. And if you say play king h7, then we go back and we're even stronger than before. So that was this rook g5 move that he plays, right? King h6. Obviously, I'm really upset to have my king shoved to the h file. Here, snip. And I thought I thought I was close, and I was. Rook f7, king g6, and let me just say some obvious things. The bishop is again getting run out of squares. I would like, if I could get my bishop, say, here, well, then I'm totally in business. If anywhere to connect with the d pawn, but I'm having real troubles doing so. And of course, if I go bishop e1 now, well, then dude has rook f6. So king g6, rook d7, king f5, rook d6, and I am real close to drawing this baby. If I could play king e5, well, then life would be pretty good. But then rook h6. And again, I'm just totally toast because king d5 snips my business. That's why I guess I deserve it, you know. Okay. So that's where, right, this thing got really close. It got really close at the end. So rook f5, bishop h4, king g6. Now, I knew I was lost here, but there's definitely, it's not, you know, on a practical level, I still have some basic chances. And the first thing is the rook needs to get back. h4, bishop e5. And, right, it's a real bummer here. King g2, and, yeah, there's not much going on for me here. If, for example, bishop g3, rook d1, there's no time for frisky business like king g4 because of rook d4. The king goes back and then the pawn starts a-rolling. So there's no friskiness. And so I played king f6. Well, I got to go back. Rook e8 was a nice move, because now I think he's winning in more than one way. Actually, let me take it back a little bit. I think the easiest way for dude here would have been rook d1, because in general, I think the h-pawn is mostly useless. And let's say, for example, here, let's play rook d3, bishop f2. Maybe I gotta. I mean, am I being incautious here? Oh yeah, king f3. That's important. Bishop e1, king e4. And once you connect, the h-pawn is fairly useless. I'm going to play rook a3, rook a6. Mostly easy business. Okay, but what white did was also winning. No bishop f2 because of rook f8. So that's his trick. I gotta wait. Now I get to run. And I'm kind of sort of close, but I'm just not. Rook h7, king g8. He gave me a little flicker of hope here by going back. But now, of course, he plays this. And there's not really anything I can do because the king is going to get to e6. And once the king gets to e6, well, it's totally over. So I played on a couple moves, but it was like bishop b8. The rook goes back, and yeah, I can't stop it. It's just such a drag. The H pawn, a meaningless, a meaningless business here. So he didn't have to allow H3 either. Yeah. So I felt like, right, I had like multiple chances in this game to make it work. And the big thing for my own chess improvement that I thought was interesting, and I think, hope maybe other people can take away from this, is back in the day, they would do analysis of these kinds of positions like this. You would literally you would have some adjournment position and it would be like this, and you'd be either white or black, and you'd have to figure it out, and you'd spend all night doing it. And that was your opportunity to really learn how endings work. And the thing, of course, about it is when it's your own game, you have a personal relationship to it in a way that if it's just some dude's game, you're not going to, right? But analyzing this kind of thing is huge, monstrous, because when you do, like, one thing I don't like say about Dvoretsky's endgame manual is he's going to give you these algorithms to solve certain positions, and that's all good, but they're not like this, right? There are certain algorithms in the back of your mind that you should have, like what are the winning positions for black and what are the drawing, or winning positions for white, what are the drawing positions for black. But beyond that, there's all kinds of other interesting considerations in a position like this. For example, the scope of the white rook being uncontained when I play f5. Josh says, I think the f4 pawn made it hard for you with the pawn on g3 and bishop on e5. It looked drawn to me. Okay, well, let's take a look. Because that goes back to this a horrible move, bishop d4, but this decision that white has with either rook b4 or excuse me, rook b4, rook f4. So let's go ahead and look again. So rook b4, I'm assuming bishop f2 is what Josh wants here. Now, I'm going to do Josh a favor. I'm just going to let him put it on e5, even though maybe it's difficult. Let's just let him have it. Here, 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 and I'm just going to follow the general plan here. So king over, and the intention is to put the white king here. Maybe f5, right? So I want to push on the king side. I get it. Okay, so f5. Let's put the rook somewhere. a4. Let's say g5. And so, right, Josh is saying the f4 break is going to be a big deal. And it might. Let's give it a shot. So king d3. Of course, I didn't have to let him. But the weird thing is I couldn't. In the game, it might be hard to actually get to bishop e5. But this is just a good thought experiment. So I'm assuming he wants f4, though g4 could be a thought too. I'm assuming he wants bishop takes. Let's just follow through with maybe what the intention. Josh is going to correct me if he dislikes any of this stuff. But yeah, this is the kind of thing where I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of it because the rook's going to land on e6. Okay, we could play why let the king into e4. Fair enough. So, right, you could play things like h5 or g4 first. I totally get it. So we say check. If king f6, check to the pawn, and let's just say king g6 for example, rook e7. This is my fear that the rook is too yeah. that the rook is too strong. For example, g4, rook e6, king here. It's a close business, I guess. Maybe let's just go with it for a second. King c4, and now maybe you shouldn't do king c4 because now f4 is maybe what we want. This might be something, yeah. Right, okay. Let's go back then and ask this bishop f2 question more in earnest. So bishop f2, rook e4, and now can black get it to e5? I guess is part of the issue. Bishop c5, let's just say, is the most intuitive move, right? King f3. Yeah, I have to. So okay. The interesting question for white, and it's going to be kind of an intuitive one when he makes it, whether it's rook b4, rook f4, is do I want the pawn on f4 like the game, which does work, right? Or do I want this one? And intuitively, I thought this was cleaner because at least black doesn't get to trade off stuff so easily. And yeah, this one seems really bad because I'm coming around the mountain. You know, let's say h5. Rook e8 or rook e7's totally reasonable. But if I'm determined to stop bishop d4, I could play king e2 first. Yeah, it's kind of a hard life. Yeah. Josh writes, I thought you were even more likely to get here if you leave the bishop on e5 to begin with after bishop d4. It's white's choice. Yeah. Well, of course, my huge blunder was playing bishop d4 in the first place. So, right, I guess as it turns out, this position was, let's say, this was the interesting decision we left last time. Josh wasn't here, by the way. I want to get his intuition on here. So, Josh, let me show you this position. I think you got here a little late. I just want to ask you. So, rook e4, I think, is drawing, but white still has some interesting push. So, the question would be, should I have played b2 instead? And the drama that I came up with was e5, de being better for white, bishop e5, rook f7. It looks insane. King h6. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would do this in a real game, but you know, something like this is the question mark. This is something obviously no sane person would do, but yeah, this was my thought for the poor dude. Josh thinks it looks insane. I kind of agree. I was just, from an analytical point of view, I couldn't figure it out for how white won. When I first saw it, I said to myself, absolutely no way. Okay, now I want to make a couple announcements before I wrap it up. Next week, I'm going to go back to my regular time, which is Wednesday. This week, we had the show where I analyze people's games, and that's like a 3-hour show, happens every last Wednesday of the month. And so we're going to go back to our regular time, and next week, I'm going to force myself to look at this game's critical moments using the computer. It's a hard thing for me to do, and like many things in this show, I'm abusing the show by forcing the show to do the things that I find hard to do myself. I just came up with an interesting try for white here. Josh has probably already said in the chat, but could I play rook f4? That looks totally evil. And I don't know if it wins, but it better scare me, right? Yeah, rook f4. It's funny. I've analyzed with Josh enough. I said to myself while I was talking, looking at that position, oh my God, rook f4. And honestly, it's hard for me to make a judgment here, but on the surface, it looks terrible. So, for example, rook f4, bishop f4. People like seeing mates, so let's put that on the board. Rook f4, snip. And I'm assuming I'm going to have to, well, maybe that's a wrong assumption. Okay, so it's either some kind of bishop f6, or it's bishop c3 maybe even, or bishop f4, of course. If bishop f4, this, maybe, I don't know. I don't know what to think of this one. This one scares me. Because, again, the rook's going to come to e6, but I do have chances, especially because I'm going to get the g4 in. This looks like it should hold, honestly. Okay. Neil, are you going over your games? Yes, this is a game that I played. The last over-the-board game that I was allowed to play. This concludes like my written portion. I did 32 pages, and I am going to do the final thing I do in all the times I analyze the game. So this is the longest, the best analysis I've ever done in my life. Is I put it into the computer. You know, I type it into ChessBase, so I have a file and stuff, and that's when I ask the computer some questions. But I'm going to do a live reveal on Wednesday, and so we'll check my intuition, which I've thought about the game a lot, and I'll check it against what the computer says. All right. So, guys, thank you very much. I will be back next week.